At approximately 8:15 p.m. on the evening of the 27th day of the fourth month of the Akhit season, in the year 1323 BC, a young king died in his bed in the palace at Memphis. He was Tutankhamun, the ruler of the two lands, the living son of Amun-Re, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. The hour is not recorded in any surviving papyrus. The date is a reconstruction based on the sequence of his burial and the known length of his reign. But the moment itself is certain. A 19-year-old pharaoh, barely out of adolescence, ceased to breathe. Everything seemed normal for a royal death. The palace staff immediately sealed the king's chambers. The priests of the state cult began the purification rituals. The embalmers were summoned from the House of Life. Only a few minutes later, something was off. The tomb that had been under construction for Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings was not yet complete. The royal craftsmen had been working on a larger, more elaborate burial complex, but it was far from finished. The death had come too soon. The officials responsible for the funeral faced a crisis. They had 70 days to prepare the body, but the tomb itself needed to be ready in the same window. They made a decision that would echo through history. They diverted to a smaller, pre-existing tomb that had been intended for a noble or perhaps another royal. They painted the walls in haste. The scenes were not as refined as they should have been. The equipment was scaled down. The king was placed in a nest of coffins, but the sarcophagus was a simple quartzite box. The burial chamber was cramped. The entire operation was a scramble. What happened? The question has occupied archaeologists, Egyptologists, and historians for over a century. Tutankhamun came to the throne as a child, around age 8 or 9, after the death of his father, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten had abandoned the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods and forced the worship of a single deity, the Aten, the sun disk. He moved the capital to a new city at Amarna. He alienated the powerful priesthood of Amun at Thebes. His reforms shattered the religious and political order that had held Egypt stable for centuries. When Akhenaten died, the country was in turmoil. His successor, a shadowy figure named Smenkhkare, ruled briefly and then disappeared. Then came Tutankhamun. He was originally named Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten, but within a few years of his accession, he changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling a restoration of the old gods. The capital was moved back to Thebes. The temples of Amun were reopened. The bureaucracy was rebuilt. The young king was guided by powerful advisors, chief among them the Vizier Ai and the General Hormheb. But Tutankhamun himself was physically frail. Modern medical examinations of his mummy, conducted using CT scans and DNA analysis between 2005 and 2010, revealed a range of health problems. He had a cleft palate. He suffered from a bone disorder called Kertler disease in his left foot, which would have made walking painful. He had contracted malaria multiple times. He also had a fracture in his left leg, likely from a fall, that had become infected. The infection may have contributed to his death. The exact cause is still debated. Some researchers argue that he died from complications of a broken leg combined with malaria. Others suggest a genetic disorder from generations of royal inbreeding. His parents were brother and sister. The mummy showed signs of a missing heart, which is unusual because the heart was traditionally left in place for the afterlife. The embalmers may have made an error, or it could have been damaged during Carter's removal of the mummy from the coffin in 1998. The heart was never found. The investigators in this case were not contemporary officials but modern scientists. Howard Carter, the British archaeologist, discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in November 1998. It was the most intact royal burial ever found in Egypt. Over 4,000 objects were packed into 4 rooms: furniture, chariots, statues, jewelry, weapons, food, wine, and the solid gold inner coffin. The discovery created a sensation, but Carter's methods were not always careful. He and his team removed the objects with haste, often damaging the mummy in the process. When the body was finally unwrapped, the inner layers were glued together by resins that had hardened over millennia. Carter used heated knives and brute force to separate the mummy from the coffin. The body was dismembered. The head was detached. The limbs were separated. It was only decades later that researchers could re-examine the remains with more advanced technology. What they found changed the story. The fracture in the leg was not post-mortem damage. It was a real injury that had occurred shortly before death. The infection in the bone was severe. The malaria parasites were present in the tissue. The cause of death, while not certain, is now widely considered to be a combination of these factors, possibly accelerated by the immune system's collapse. But the deeper question is not simply how Tutankhamun died. It is how the Egyptian empire itself functioned as a system that could produce a boy king, suffer a heretic interruption, and still survive for another 1,000 years. The empire of the Pharaohs spanned 3,000 years. That is 10 times the length of the Roman Empire. To understand how such a civilization could endure, we have to step back from the deathbed of one young king and look at the machinery behind the throne. The pharaoh was not just a ruler, he was a god on earth. He was the intermediary between the human and the divine. He was responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth, justice, and balance. If the pharaoh failed, the land would fall into chaos. The Nile could fail to flood, the crops could wither, the enemies at the borders could invade. The entire society was built on the belief that the pharaoh's health and power were directly tied to the health of Egypt itself. That belief system was the foundation of the state. It justified the absolute authority of the king. It also justified the immense expenditure of wealth on pyramids, temples, and tombs. The first period of the Egyptian Empire, known as the Old Kingdom, began around 2686 BC and lasted until about 2181 BC. It was during this time that the Great Pyramid of Giza was built under Pharaoh Khufu. The pyramid required the coordination of tens of thousands of workers, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and a food supply chain that stretched across the country. The logistics alone were staggering. How could a society with no iron tools, no modern machinery, and no written records of the construction process achieve such precision? The investigators of this question are modern engineers and archaeologists who have reconstructed the likely methods based on evidence from quarries, ramps, and tool marks. They found that the blocks were cut with copper saws and dolerite hammers, hauled on wooden sleds over wet sand to reduce friction, and dragged up earthen ramps that were raised as the pyramid grew. The ramps themselves required millions of tons of mud brick and rubble. The workforce was not composed of slaves, contrary to popular myth. The builders were conscripted laborers who served in rotating crews, fed on beef, bread, and beer, and buried near the pyramid with honor. The system worked because the state controlled the harvest, the labor, and the religion. The pharaoh was the center. When the king died, his body was mummified to preserve it for the afterlife. The pyramid was designed to protect his body and his spirit, the Ka, and to provide him with everything he needed in the next world. But the system had built-in vulnerabilities. The Old Kingdom collapsed after a series of weak pharaohs, drought, and decentralization of power. The pyramid tombs were looted. The royal authority fractured. The country entered a period of civil war known as the First Intermediate Period. Then came the Middle Kingdom, starting around 2055 BC. The pharaohs reunified Egypt, moved the capital to Thebes, and expanded trade with Nubia and the Near East. The Middle Kingdom was a more bureaucratic and literary age. The pharaohs were depicted not as remote gods but as shepherds of the people. They built irrigation projects, expanded the army, and commissioned some of the greatest works of Egyptian literature, such as the Tale of Sinu. But again, the system failed. A group of foreign invaders, the Hyksos, swept into the Nile Delta using horse-drawn chariots and composite bows. Egypt had never faced such technology. The Hyksos ruled Lower Egypt for over a century. The Egyptian pharaohs of the south were reduced to vassals. That humiliation led to the New Kingdom, the third and final peak of the empire, beginning around 1550 BC. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom were warriors. They expelled the Hyksos, conquered Nubia, and pushed into Canaan and Syria. They built a professional army, introduced the chariot, and made Egypt into an imperial power. The wealth from tribute and conquest filled the temples of Karnak and Luxor. The pharaohs were buried in the Valley of the Kings, no longer in pyramids but in rock-cut tombs hidden in the cliffs. But with power came corruption. The priesthood of Amun became enormously wealthy and influential, sometimes rivaling the pharaoh himself. It was because of this that Akhenaten attempted his religious revolution. He tried to destroy the power of the Amun priesthood by promoting Aten worship and dismantling the old temples. But his reforms were unpopular and unsustainable. His capital at Amarna was abandoned after his death. The priests regained control, and the young Tutankhamun, the restorer, died before he could fully stabilize the kingdom. His successors, Ai and Horemheb, erased many records of the Amarna period. Horemheb, a general who became pharaoh, purged the bureaucracy and re-established order, but the seeds of decline had been planted. The empire would be threatened by the Sea Peoples, the Libyans, the Nubians, and eventually the Assyrians, Persians, and Greeks. The pharaohs ruled for another 8 centuries after Tutankhamun, but their power was increasingly fragmented. The last native pharaoh was Nectanebo II, who fled into Nubia in 343 BC when the Persians invaded. Then came Alexander the Great and the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek pharaohs. The last of them, Cleopatra VII, died in 30 BC, and Egypt became a Roman province. The 3,000 years of pharaohs had ended, but the question remains: how could a single civilization persist for so long through so many upheavals? The answer lies not in the pharaohs alone, but in the systems they built. The irrigation that fed the population, the bureaucracy that collected taxes and stored grain, the religion that unified belief and justified authority, the writing system that recorded laws and history, and the art and architecture that communicated power across generations. When those systems worked, Egypt was stable. When they broke, Egypt swung between chaos and order. But each time, the memory of the old kingdom, the old order, was strong enough to be revived. The pharaohs were the symbol of that continuity. Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered intact in 1922, became the most famous symbol of ancient Egypt. But it is also a symbol of how fragile the empire was. One young king, buried in a rush in a borrowed tomb with a missing heart. That was the reality behind the monumental facade. The investigators, Carter, the anatomists, the CT scanners, have pieced together the story of his death and the empire around him. But they have also uncovered the uncomfortable truth that Egypt's greatness was built on the backs of millions of anonymous workers, on the suppression of dissent, on the exploitation of conquered lands, and on a system that treated the pharaoh as a god even when he was a crippled teenager. That is the story of the Egyptian empire. Not just gold and pyramids, but blood, sweat, and the constant struggle to maintain the order that the pharaohs promised. And it began not with Tutankhamun's death, but with the very first pharaoh, the king who united the two lands, whose name has survived on a ceremonial pallet, Narmer. But that is a story for another moment. In 1898, during an excavation at the Temple of Horus at Hierakonpolis, the British archaeologist James Quibble uncovered a ceremonial pallet carved from siltstone. It stood roughly 2 feet tall. On one side, a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt wielded a mace over a kneeling prisoner. On the other side, the same king appeared wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, flanked by attendants and the severed heads of enemies. The pallet was dated to around 3100 BC. Its carvings recorded the unification of Egypt. The king was Narmer, and this artifact, now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, became the earliest known representation of a pharaoh. But what exactly happened? How does a single pallet provide a foundation for 3,000 years of rule? The Narmer pallet was not a historical document in the modern sense. It was propaganda. It showed a moment that had already occurred, the conquest of Lower Egypt by the south. The details, however, were carefully chosen. Narmer was shown as both a warrior and a divine figure. The falcon god Horus perched above his captive. The message was clear. The unification was not only political but ordained by the gods. Investigators of the palette, including early Egyptologists like Flinders Petrie, studied the iconography and the names inscribed in early hieroglyphs. They found that Narmer's name appeared in a serek, a box representing the palace facade. That became the standard way pharaohs wrote their names for centuries. But the palette raised unanswered questions. Was Narmer the first pharaoh, or was he the one who completed a process started earlier? The evidence from other sites at Abydos and Nakata suggested that the unification was a gradual process. Narmer's tomb at Abydos, small compared to later kings, contained objects bearing both the Horus name and the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt. But no explicit account of the conquest survives. The records are fragmentary. What is certain is that by the end of the pre-dynastic period, around 3100 BC, Egypt was a single state stretching from the Nile Delta to the first cataract at Aswan. The capital was established at Memphis, a strategic location where the Nile Valley meets the Delta. From that point forward, the pharaoh was the center. The early dynasties, known as the First and Second Dynasties, laid the administrative and religious foundations. The pharaohs were buried at Abydos in mud-brick tombs with subsidiary burials of servants and animals. Evidence from seal impressions and ivory tags showed that a centralized bureaucracy already existed. Taxes were collected in grain and livestock. A system of fields and boundaries was recorded. The king was served by a chancellor, a treasurer, and overseers of the granaries. But the state was still fragile. The Second Dynasty ended with a period of internal conflict, possibly religious. The pharaoh Khasikhemwy, the last ruler of the dynasty, built a stone enclosure at Abydos and used the title, the Two Ladies, combining the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt and the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt. It was a subtle indicator that unity needed to be continuously asserted. Then came the Third Dynasty, beginning around 2686 BC. The pharaoh Djoser chose an architect named Imhotep to build his tomb. Imhotep was a priest, a physician, and a sage. He designed a step pyramid of 6 mastabas stacked one upon another, rising to a height of 203 feet. It was the first monument entirely made of cut stone, a leap from mudbrick and timber to the eternal. The step pyramid was surrounded by a vast funerary complex of chapels, courtyards, and a boundary wall with a single entrance. Djoser's name and the complex were discovered in the 1810s by European explorers, but systematic excavation by Cecil Firth and later Jean-Philippe Lauer in the 20th century uncovered the full layout. What investigators found was not just a tomb but a stage for the pharaoh's afterlife. The rooms and corridors were decorated with stone reliefs showing the king performing rituals, fighting enemies, and celebrating the Hebsed festival, a renewal of his rule. The question of how Imhotep devised the step pyramid remains unanswered. No blueprints survive, but the scale of the project required a command of quarrying, transport, and construction that had never existed before. Djoser's reign was stable. His pyramid endured, but the cost was immense. The labor force, the materials, the supply chains all demanded a state that could plan decades ahead. That state existed because the pharaoh was unquestioned. The Fourth Dynasty, starting around 2613 BC, took pyramid building to its peak. Sneferu, the first pharaoh of the dynasty, built 3 pyramids. The first at Meidum collapsed because the outer casing was too steep. The second at Dashur was built with a mid-construction angle change, the bent pyramid. The third, the Red Pyramid, was a true pyramid with smooth sides. Investigators who studied the Red Pyramid in the 20th century found the burial chamber intact but empty. No treasure, no inscription. The king's body may have been removed by later plunderers, or perhaps he was buried elsewhere. The sequence of Sneferu's pyramids showed that Egyptian engineers learned from their failures. The bent pyramid, with its strange shape, was not a mistake but a correction. When the structure began to crack, the builders reduced the angle to prevent collapse. They understood stress distribution intuitively, without modern mathematics. That knowledge was passed to Sneferu's son, Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid at Giza. The Great Pyramid required approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing on average 2.5 tons, moved from quarries by boat and hauled up ramps. The construction took an estimated 20 years. The workforce was not slaves but a rotating national service. Excavations near the pyramid in the 1990s by Mark Lehner found bakeries, breweries, barracks, and a harbor. The workers were fed meat, fish, and bread, evidence of a well-organized provisioning system. The Great Pyramid's original casing stones, polished white limestone, were later removed for buildings in Cairo. What remained was the core. The internal chambers included the king's chamber, with a granite sarcophagus that was empty when first measured. The queen's chamber, the grand gallery, the descending passage, the shafts, all were investigated by early explorers like Caliph al-Mamun in the 9th century, who broke in after discovering the entrance. What they found was nothing. The pyramid had been robbed long before. The unanswered question, who was buried there and where are the grave goods? The answer is unknown. Khufu's body is lost, his treasures are gone, but the pyramid itself was a machine of resurrection. The king's spirit, the Ka, needed the pyramid to endure. That belief had driven the entire project. After Khufu, the 4th dynasty continued with Khafre and Menkaure. Khafre's pyramid is slightly smaller but appears taller because it sits on higher bedrock. The Sphinx, a colossal limestone statue with a human head and lion body, sits next to his pyramid. The Sphinx was carved from a natural outcropping of softer rock. Its face may represent Khafre. The head was later restored in the New Kingdom. In the early 20th century, archaeologists dug around the Sphinx and found the dream stela of Thutmose IV, a granite slab that described how the pharaoh, as a prince, fell asleep in its shadow and was told by the god Harmachis that if he cleared the sand, he would become king. It was propaganda, but it showed that the Sphinx was already ancient by Thutmose's time. The 4th dynasty used massive resources without hesitation. The economy depended on the annual Nile flood, which deposited fertile silt across the fields. Crops were planted and harvested under the supervision of the state. The pharaoh controlled the grain. He could feed the builders or starve rebels. The system was efficient but brittle. The 4th dynasty ended with a succession of short reigns and possible intrigues. The pyramid building pace slowed. The 5th dynasty shifted to sun temples, dedicated to Ra, the sun god. The pyramid texts, a collection of spells carved inside the pyramids of the late 5th and 6th dynasties, gave insight into the royal afterlife. They described the king's journey through the underworld, his battles with demons, his meeting with the gods. These texts were the earliest religious writings in the world. Investigators like Kurt Seth translated them in the early 20th century, revealing a complex theology where the pharaoh was not just a god but a participant in the cosmic cycle. The 6th dynasty saw the reign of Pepi II, who came to the throne as a child and ruled for at least 60 years, possibly 90. His pyramid complex at Saqqara was smaller than earlier ones. The texts inside showed a developed belief system, but after his death, Egypt collapsed. The Old Kingdom entered the first intermediate period around 2181 BC, a dark age of civil war, famine, and decentralization. The provinces became independent. Nomarchs, local governors, built their own tombs and used their own dates. The royal tombs were looted. The state granaries emptied. The art and architecture of the period were crude. What happened? The evidence from sedimentary cores and climate reconstructions showed a severe drought that lasted decades. The Nile flood failed repeatedly. The crops failed. The population starved. The central government could not respond because the provinces had already accumulated too much power. The pharaoh lost control of the resources. The people turned to local strongmen. The belief in the pharaoh's divinity was tested, yet the memory of the old order persisted. In the south, the city of Thebes began to rise. By approximately 2055 BC, the Theban prince Mentuhotep II reunified Egypt, beginning the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep built his tomb complex at Deir el-Bahri, a cliffside platform with a ramp and terraces. It was a synthesis of pyramid and rock-cut tomb. He was depicted as the god Osiris in a black-painted statue. The reunification was not bloodless. Reliefs from his temple showed the siege of the city of Heracleopolis. He crushed the northern rivals. The Middle Kingdom was more bureaucratic than the Old. The pharaohs styled themselves as shepherds, not distant gods. They built canals to expand irrigation, fortified the border at Nubia, and introduced the use of the shaduf, a counterweighted pole to lift water. The literature of the period, preserved on papyrus, included the story of Sinu, an official who fled Egypt and lived among the Bedouin, then returned in old age to be buried properly. It was a meditation on exile and identity. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs also built pyramids, but they were made of mud brick with stone casing, and many have collapsed. Senusret III, a warrior pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, led military campaigns deep into Nubia. He built a canal around the first cataract to facilitate boat traffic. He also set up boundary stelae at Semna, marking the limit of Egyptian control. His portraits showed a moody, stern face with heavy-lidded eyes, possibly a conscious choice to project gravity. He was deified after his death. His reign was stable, but the seeds of decline were again present. The royal power relied on the loyalty of the nomarchs. When the central authority weakened in the 13th dynasty, the nomarchs again became independent. Then came the Second Intermediate Period, around 1650 BC. Foreign invaders known as the Hyksos entered the Nile Delta from the east. The Hyksos were not a single tribe but a mix of Asiatic peoples. They brought bronze weapons, horse-drawn chariots, and composite bows, technologies Egypt had never seen. The Hyksos established a capital at Avaris and ruled Lower Egypt for about a century. The Egyptian pharaohs in the south at Thebes were vassals, paying tribute. The mummy of the Theban king Seqenenre showed multiple fatal wounds, a crushed forehead, a blow to the face, a cut to the neck. It was likely he died in battle against the Hyksos. His son, Kamose, continued the war. Kamose' second son, Ahmose, finally drove the Hyksos out of Egypt around 1550 BC, destroying Avaris and pursuing them into southern Canaan. Ahmose founded the New Kingdom, the third great period of empire. The New Kingdom pharaohs were soldiers. They expanded Egypt's borders to the Euphrates River in the north and deep into Nubia in the south. Thutmose I, later Thutmose III, conquered the largest empire Egypt ever held. Thutmose III's military campaigns were recorded on the walls of the Karnak Temple. In the 22nd year of his reign, he fought the Battle of Megiddo, a Canaanite city. He took a risky route through a narrow pass, against the advice of his generals. The enemy was caught by surprise. The city fell after a 7-month siege. Thutmose III's annals, copied on papyrus, listed the plunder: thousands of prisoners, chariots, horses, cattle, and gold. The empire brought enormous wealth. The temples grew rich. The priesthood of Amun at Thebes became a political force. The pharaohs needed to maintain control. This tension led to the most radical break in Egyptian history, the reign of Akhenaten. Akhenaten, originally named Amenhotep IV, moved the capital to a new city at Amarna, built temples to the Aten, the sun disk, and banned the worship of Amun. He erased Amun's name from inscriptions. He changed art style to elongated figures, informal scenes of family life. He declared himself the sole intermediary between the Aten and humanity. The reforms were a direct challenge to the priesthood. He also built the city quickly, but it was abandoned after his death. His son, Tutankhamun, restored the old religion but died young. The Amarna period was later condemned as heresy. Investigators who discovered the tomb of the nobleman Ramos at Thebes saw the transition firsthand. The tomb had both traditional scenes and Amarna-style reliefs. The question of why Akhenaten did this remains debated. Was it a genuine religious revelation, or a political move to centralize power? The Amarna letters, clay tablets from the city, showed that Egypt was losing its diplomatic and military influence in the Levant during Akhenaten's reign. The Hittite Empire was expanding. Egypt's vassals argued among themselves. Akhenaten did not respond to their pleas for aid. The empire began to fragment. After Tutankhamun, the general Horemheb became pharaoh and purged the Amarna kings from the records. He restored order. Then the 19th dynasty began with Ramesses I, a short reign, and then Seti I, who built a magnificent temple at Abydos and a well-preserved tomb in the Valley of the Kings. His son, Ramesses II, reigned for 66 years. He fought the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC. The battle was a near disaster. The Egyptian army was ambushed. Ramesses II's personal courage saved the day, but the battle was a draw. The subsequent treaty with the Hittites, inscribed on a silver tablet, was the first recorded peace treaty in history. Copies survive in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. Ramesses II built extensively: the Ramesseum, the temples at Abu Simbel, additions to Karnak and Luxor. He had dozens of wives and over 100 children. His mummy, found in the Deir el-Bahari cache, showed red hair and arthritis. His empire was stable, but the costs were high. The state became increasingly militarized. The priesthood of Amun grew even more powerful. The land was granted to temples, tax-free. By the end of the 19th dynasty, corruption and succession conflicts weakened the throne. The 20th dynasty began with Ramesses III, who faced three major invasions: the Libyans, the Sea Peoples, and a second Libyan incursion. The Sea Peoples were a confederation of maritime raiders from the Aegean and Anatolia. They destroyed the Hittite Empire and attacked Egypt. Ramesses III defeated them in a naval battle in the Nile Delta, recorded in the Medinet Habu Temple. But the defeat exhausted Egypt. The economy contracted. The state could not pay the workers at Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb builders. In the 29th year of Ramesses III, the workers went on strike, the first documented labor strike in history. They marched to the Ramesseum and demanded grain. They got some, but the system was failing. Ramesses III was assassinated in the Harem conspiracy, revealed by a judicial papyrus. The pharaoh's throat was cut. His mummy, examined by CT scan in 2012, showed a deep wound across the neck, severed vertebrae, and a toe missing from an axe blow. The conspirators were tried and executed, but the dynasty continued and decline accelerated. After Ramesses III, the late New Kingdom saw 8 pharaohs named Ramesses, each weaker than the last. The state lost control of Nubia. The tomb robberies increased. The Valley of the Kings was raided repeatedly. Priests moved the mummies of great pharaohs from their tombs to secret caches. In 1881, the Deir el-Bahari cache was discovered by the El Rishal family, then excavated by the Egyptian Antiquities Service. It contained 40 mummies, including Ramesses II, Seti I, and Ahmose. The cache revealed the lengths to which the priests had gone to preserve the royal bodies. But the empire was already over. The third intermediate period followed, with Libyan pharaohs, then Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal invaded and sacked Thebes in 663 BC. The Great Library of Nineveh recorded the destruction. The city lost its power. Then came the Sate Renaissance under Psamtik I, who united Egypt briefly. The Persians conquered in 525 BC. The last native pharaoh, Nectanebo II, fled to Nubia in 343 BC. Then Alexander, then the Ptolemies, then the Romans. The 3,000 years ended not with a bang, but with a slow dissolution of identity. Investigators have pieced together this narrative through inscriptions, papyri, mummies, settlements, and objects. The unanswered questions are many. Why did the empire last so long? Because its institution, the kingship, the bureaucracy, the religion, the writing, were remarkably adaptive. Each collapse was followed by a resurrection. The idea of Egypt was stronger than any single pharaoh, but the human cost was enormous. The anonymous workers who built the pyramids, the soldiers who died in Canaan, the peasants who starved when the Nile failed, they are the silent thousands beneath the monuments. The pharaohs, even the great ones, were mortal. Their mummies are on display. The golden mask of Tutankhamun shines in a museum, but the empire that produced it is gone. That is the story of the Egyptian empire, not just gold and glass, but a machine of power that endured longer than any other. On the 6th of June in 1881, a man named Ahmed el-Rishal arrived at the Egyptian Antiquities Service in Cairo. He carried a small wooden coffin and a set of scrolls. The scrolls were papyri. The coffin was inscribed with the name of a pharaoh. Ahmed claimed he had found them in a tomb near Thebes. The officials were skeptical. The el-Rishal family had been involved in the illicit antiquities trade for years, but the papyri were genuine, funerary texts from the 18th dynasty. The service sent an inspector, Emile Brugsch, to investigate. Brugsch followed Ahmed to the Valley of the Kings. At a cliff face near the Temple of Hatshepsut, Ahmed pointed to a narrow shaft. Brugsch was lowered down on a rope. Shaft opened into a corridor packed with coffins. Coffins stacked on coffins, dozens of them. Some were gilded. Many were inscribed with royal cartouches. Brugsch realized he was standing inside a cache of royal mummies. The discovery had begun 8 years earlier in 1873. A member of the el-Rishal family, while searching for a lost goat, had stumbled into the cleft. He found a hidden chamber. Inside were rows of mummies, some with intact wrappings, others broken open by ancient tomb robbers. The family kept the location secret for years. They sold pieces on the black market. They removed small items, amulets, fragments of linen slowly. But the scale of the find was too large to hide forever. By 1881, rumors reached the Antiquities Service. Ahmed el-Rishal, hoping to avoid prosecution, decided to reveal the site. Brugsch's first descent was on the 6th of June. He returned the next day with a team. They began clearing the corridor. The temperature was stifling. The air was thick with dust and the smell of ancient wood and resin. They counted the coffins. There were 40. Some were empty, but most contained mummies. The first they identified was Ahmose, the founder of the New Kingdom. Then Amenhotep I, Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, the great conquerors. Then Seti I, Ramesses II, Ramesses III. The names read like a roll call of Egypt's imperial age. They found queens, princes, and high priests. The mummies had been rewrapped, tagged with labels written by the priests of the 21st dynasty. The tags recorded the original tomb and the date of reburial. The priests had moved them from the Valley of the Kings to this secret chamber in the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari. What happened? The tomb robberies that began in the late New Kingdom had grown systematic. By the reign of Ramesses IX, around 1125 BC, papyri documented trials of tomb robbers. Some of the accused were officials from the Theban necropolis. They entered the tombs at night, broke open sarcophagi, stripped the gold and jewelry, and burned the wooden coffins. The government tried to stop them. The authorities increased patrols. They repaired tomb seals, but the thieves were inside the administration. The economy was collapsing. The state could not pay its workers. The same workers who built the royal tombs knew exactly where the treasures were. The robbery records from the Abbot Papyrus, dated to the 16th year of Ramesses IX, listed dozens of tombs that had been entered. Some of the tombs of great pharaohs were already empty. The priests of Amun, who controlled the temples, decided on a drastic solution. They would gather the royal mummies and move them to a secure location. The operation began around 1080 BC, during the reign of Ramesses XI. The high priest of Amun, Pinjam I, ordered the first transfers. The mummies were taken from their original tombs, rewrapped, placed in new coffins, and carried by boat across the Nile. They were hidden in the tomb of Enhepi, a queen of the 17th dynasty, then later moved again. The final move was into the Deir el-Bahari shaft. The priests worked at night. They recorded each transfer on the wrapping linen and on the interior of the coffins. The tags were written in hieratic. They gave the name of the deceased, the date of the move, and sometimes the condition of the mummy. For example, the tag on the mummy of Ramesses II read, Year 17, 3rd month of the inundation, Day 1 on. Restoration of the burial of Usermater Setipener Ramesses II in the place of eternity. But the restoration was not complete. Many mummies had been damaged by the robbers. The priests tried to repair them. They reattached limbs, stuffed linen into cavities, and painted resin over wounds. They placed amulets and new bandages. The mummy of Seti I showed evidence of extensive rewrapping. The mummy of Thutmose III had its head separated from the body, then reattached with linen. The priests did their best with the means they had. They also added new inscriptions, asking the gods to protect the pharaohs in their new resting place. Then they sealed the shaft. The chamber remained hidden for nearly 3,000 years. How could the priests have moved 40 mummies without detection? The answer lies in the political situation. The high priests of Amun were the de facto rulers of Upper Egypt. The Ramesside pharaohs had lost authority. The priesthood controlled the army, the grain stores, and the temples. The transfer of the mummies was an act of preservation undertaken by the clergy, not by the state. The state was too weak to object. The pharaohs of the late 20th dynasty were shadows. The last of them, Ramesses XI, died around 1070 BC. After his death, the country split. The north was ruled by Smins from Tanis. The south was ruled by the high priests of Amun. The mummies belonged to the south. The priests moved them as a matter of religious duty, not as a secret conspiracy. They left written records of the moves in the papyrus archives of the temples, but the exact location of the final cache was known only to a few. When the priesthood itself declined, the knowledge was lost. The cache at Deir el-Bahari was not the only one. In 1898, another cache was found in the Valley of the Kings, inside the tomb of Amenhotep II. The tomb had been robbed in antiquity, but the robbers missed a side chamber. That chamber contained mummies of several pharaohs, including Amenhotep III, Meremptah, and Ramesses IV through Ramesses VI. The mummies were moved there by the priests around the same time as the Deir el-Bahari cache. The two caches together contained most of the royal mummies of the New Kingdom. The priests had saved the pharaohs from complete destruction, but they had also erased the original tombs. Many of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings were found empty. The decorations remained, but the occupants were gone. The modern investigation of the mummies began when the Deir el-Bahari cache was evacuated in 1880. The mummies were loaded onto a steamboat and shipped to Cairo. By the time they arrived, many had deteriorated further. The wrappings were brittle. The bodies were exposed to air and light. The Egyptian government had no precedent for handling royal mummies. They were placed in the Egyptian Museum, where they were examined by scholars. In 1886, Gaston Maspero unwrapped the mummy of Ramesses II. He measured the body, noted the red hair, and published a description. The hair color was caused by the resin and the process of mummification, but some historians speculated about racial origins. The science was crude. Maspero described the mummy as having a narrow face, a prominent nose, a receding forehead. He made a sketch. The mummy was photographed. Came a tourist attraction. In the 1970, the mummies were moved to the Royal Mummy Room in the Egyptian Museum, where they were displayed in climate-controlled cases. The public could see the faces of the pharaohs, but the displays raised ethical questions. Were these religious objects? Should the bodies of the deceased be exhibited? The Egyptian government argued that the mummies were artifacts of historical importance. Tourists paid to see them. The mummies brought revenue, but the controversy continued. In 2007, the government decided to close the Royal Mummy Room for renovations, partly in response to criticism from human rights groups. The mummies were moved to a new display at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Tuzir-Twoon. A grand procession through the streets of Cairo carried the bodies of 22 pharaohs, including Ramesses II, Seti I, and Hatshepsut. The parade was broadcast globally. It was a state event, a declaration of national pride, but it also acknowledged the dead as political symbols. The unanswered questions from the cache are many. Not all mummies were identified correctly. The mummy of Thutmose I was thought to be in the cache, but a later examination argued that it was not. The mummy of Hatshepsut was misidentified for decades. It had been left in the tomb of her nurse, a wet nurse named Sitter. In 2007, a CT scan and DNA analysis linked a mummy from that tomb to a lock of hair found in a box inscribed with Hatshepsut's name. The mummy was re-identified as Hatshepsut herself. She had died in her 50s, possibly from cancer. The evidence was not conclusive, but it was accepted by many Egyptologists. The process of identification continues. New techniques, ancient DNA, stable isotope analysis, CT scans, are applied to the mummies each decade. Each study answers one question and raises another. In 2012, a team of radiologists at the Qasr Al Aini Hospital in Cairo performed a CT scan on the mummy of Ramesses III. They found a transverse wound across the throat, 7 centimeters wide, reaching down to the vertebrae. The wound had cut the esophagus and trachea. The pharaoh had died instantly. But the scan also found a bronze knife blade embedded in the neck, broken off from the handle. Blade had been overlooked in earlier examinations. The forensic analysis confirmed the account of the harem conspiracy papyrus, which described how Ramesses III was killed by conspirators using knives. The papyrus had been found in the 1810s in Medinet Habu, but many scholars doubted that the assassination was real. The CT scan made it fact. The papyrus listed the names of the conspirators: the Queen Tut, her son Pentower, and 14 palace officials. They were tried and executed. The judicial papyrus noted that Pentower committed suicide by poison. The CT scan later showed that a mummy found in the Deir el-Bahari cache, a young man in his late teens, had been strangled or poisoned. This mummy, previously unidentified, was tentatively identified as Pentower. The pieces fit, but other details remain unresolved. Why did Ramesses III's mummy show a missing toe? The CT scan revealed that the toe had been chopped off by a heavy blade, probably an axe, during the assassination. The priests had restored the foot with linen and resin. The missing toe was a small detail, but it pointed to the violence of the event. The same papyrus named officials who were supposed to have failed to stop the conspiracy. It mentioned a court official named Pieback who was caught with letters from the queen. The letters were intercepted. The conspiracy was detected, but not before Ramesses III was killed. The question of why the conspirators acted is still debated. Was it rivalry among the royal wives? Was it the declining power of the pharaoh? The papyrus does not give motives. It only records the punishment. The investigation of the Deir el-Bahari cache also revealed the fates of lesser-known pharaohs. The mummy of Seqenenre, who died in battle against the Hyksos, was in the cache. His skull showed 5 wounds, each consistent with a Hyksos axe blade. The wounds were examined in the 1960s by a team of forensic dentists who noted that the skull had been fractured in a way that matched a specific type of weapon known from Hyksos sites. The evidence supported the account of the war between the Thebans and the Hyksos, but the mummy also showed evidence of mummification that was rushed. The brain had been removed, but the rest of the internal organs were left in place. This suggested that Seqenenre had died away from the royal embalming workshops, perhaps on the battlefield. His body was brought back and mummified quickly. The haste contributed to the preservation issues. The cache also contained the mummy of Amenhotep I, the second pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. His mummy had been unwrapped in 1932 and never examined properly. In 2021, CT scanning revealed that his wrappings were still intact, with floral garlands, bracelets, and amulets in place. The scan showed his face for the first time in 3,000 years. He had a narrow jaw, a small nose, and a slight overbite. His mummy had not been rewrapped like the others, suggesting that his tomb had not been robbed. The priests moved him as a precaution. He was the only New Kingdom pharaoh whose mummy had never been disturbed by robbers. That is one reason he remained undamaged. The process of reburial in the 21st dynasty was itself a significant event. The high priest Herihor, who ruled in Thebes around 1070 BC, ordered the first phase of transfers. Herihor's inscriptions on the temple of Khonsu at Karnak mention the restoration of the kings of the two lands. He claimed to have moved the mummies to places where they could rest undisturbed. He also made donations of linen and resins for rewrapping. The operation was expensive. It required scribes, embalmers, and laborers. The resources came from the temple treasury. The state could not have funded it. The priesthood absorbed the cost, but the secrecy of the caches led to later misunderstandings. When Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, he heard stories of pharaohs buried in hidden chambers. The tomb of Cheops, he wrote, was in a vault beneath the pyramid, accessible only by a secret passage. He did not know that the mummy had been moved or destroyed. The pyramids themselves, by his time, had been robbed. The Great Pyramid of Giza still contained the granite sarcophagus of Khufu, but the mummy was gone. The robbers had taken it in the First Intermediate Period, centuries earlier. The pyramid builders could not protect their dead. The Romans later tried to find the pharaohs' tombs. The Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD visited the Valley of the Kings and had his name carved on a tomb entrance. His officials searched for treasures. They found nothing of value. The tombs were already stripped. The later Christians in the early monastic period used some tombs as hermitages. They lit fires inside, blackening the ceilings. They left graffiti in Greek and Coptic. The mummies were long gone. The history of the Egyptian empire is a story of repeated loss and recovery. The empire itself collapsed. The writing system died. The language was forgotten for over 1,000 years. When the hieroglyphs were deciphered in 1822 by Jean-François Champollion, the modern world began to reconstruct the past. The mummies provided DNA, the temples provided texts, the papyri provided tax records and poetry. The 3,000 years became legible again, but each answer led to new questions. Why did the empire last so long? The institutions were adaptable. The kingship survived 67 reigns over a millennium. The religion absorbed new gods. The writing system outlasted the pharaohs, but the empire also depended on a single river. When the Nile failed, the state starved. When the army was defeated, the borders collapsed. When the priesthood grew too powerful, the throne weakened. The empire ended not because of a single catastrophe, but because of a slow accumulation of pressures that could no longer be managed by a pharaoh who was, after all, only a man. The mummies that were moved, rewrapped, and hidden are now in museums. The pharaohs who once owned the land are boxed and catalogued. The gold of Tutankhamun is viewed by millions. The empire that produced it is gone. The only trace of its long existence is the sand, the stone, and the bodies of the dead. The story of the Egyptian empire is a story of survival and decay, of power and fragility, of 3,000 years of pharaohs who believed they would rule forever, and who were proved wrong by the slow march of time. On the 16th of February, 2010, the results of a 12-year DNA and radiological study on the mummies of the Amarna period were published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The study was led by Zahi Hawass, then head of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, and carried out by a team of geneticists from Egypt and Germany. They had been working with samples from 11 royal mummies, including the 22nd dynasty mummies and the suspected parents of Tutankhamun. The goal was to identify the boy king's mother and father, and to determine the cause of his death. The study was the first large-scale genetic investigation of Egyptian royal mummies. It was also one of the most controversial. The team faced significant obstacles. The mummies had been moved, rewrapped, and contaminated by generations of archaeologists, priests, and museum visitors. Bacterial DNA and modern human DNA had seeped into the bone over 5,000 years. The researchers had to extract samples from deep inside the bones, using sterile drills and newly developed protocols to avoid contamination. They tested and retested each sample multiple times. They compared the results with modern DNA to filter out foreign sequences. The process was slow and the margins for error were small. The first surprise came from the mummy known as KV5, found in the Valley of the Kings in 1900. The mummy had been badly damaged and its identity had been debated for a century. Some thought it was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. Others thought it was Smenkhkare, a shadowy co-regent. The DNA analysis revealed that the mummy was the father of Tutankhamun. That made it almost certainly Akhenaten. but the skeletal analysis showed that the man was between 35 and 45 years old at death, which was older than previously estimated for Akhenaten, who was thought to have died in his late 20s. The team concluded that the earlier age estimates were wrong. The mummy of KV5 was Akhenaten. The second surprise came from the mummy labeled KV21A, found in the Valley of the Kings in 1817 by Giovanni Belzoni. The mummy was of a woman, but her identity was unknown. The geneticists tested her DNA and found that she was the mother of the two stillborn fetuses buried in Tutankhamun's tomb. That made her Tutankhamun's wife, likely Ankhesenamun, his half-sister. The mummy had been neglected for centuries. Her face was missing. Her bones were scattered. The DNA was a fragile connection, but the most significant finding was the identification of Tutankhamun's mother. They had a mummy called the Younger Lady, found in KV3 in 1898. She had been damaged by tomb robbers and had a gaping hole in her chest and face. The team tested her DNA and found that she was the full sister of Akhenaten. This meant that Tutankhamun was the child of a brother-sister union. The ancient Egyptian royal family of the 18th dynasty had practiced incestuous marriage for generations to preserve the divine bloodline. The results were now visible in the bones. Radiological scans of Tutankhamun's mummy revealed multiple congenital defects. He had a cleft palate, a club foot, and a condition called Koehler disease, which caused necrosis in one foot bone. He also had a severe case of malaria detected in his DNA. He walked with a cane, and the canes found in his tomb were not ceremonial but orthopedic. He died at age 19. The likely cause of death was a combination of a broken leg, possibly from a chariot fall, and a severe malarial infection that his weakened immune system could not fight. The study answered a question that had been debated for a century, but it also raised new ones. How could the royal court allow a pharaoh with such severe disabilities to rule? The answer lay in the religious system. Tutankhamun had been chosen as a child because he was the only living male heir of Akhenaten. His half-sister Ankhesenamun was already married to him. The court priests and generals managed the state. The pharaoh was a figurehead for the first years of his reign. The deformities were hidden by bandages and heavy clothing. The canes were presented as symbols of power. The truth was known only to a few. The study also revealed that the two mummies of the stillborn fetuses were female. Their DNA matched Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun. They had been buried in the tomb because they were the pharaoh's children. The death of the babies may have been from genetic defects. The royal bloodline was dying out. The paper published in 2010 was not accepted without criticism. Some scientists questioned the reliability of DNA from ancient Egyptian mummies. The hot climate and the chemical embalming processes degrade DNA. The team had used PCR sequencing, a technique that can amplify even small fragments, but it also amplifies contamination. The Egyptian authorities defended the findings, and subsequent studies by independent labs confirmed the basic results. The parentage of Tutankhamun is now accepted. What does this story tell us about the Egyptian empire? The pharaohs were not only political rulers, but also the physical embodiment of divine kingship. Their bodies were sacred. Their marriages were planned to keep the blood of the gods pure, but that purity came at a cost. The incestuous unions, while preserving the royal line within the family, also concentrated genetic disorders. The 18th dynasty produced some of the most powerful pharaohs in history, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, but by the end of the dynasty, the genetics had declined. Akhenaten had an elongated skull, possibly from a genetic abnormality. His daughters had similar features. Tutankhamun had a club foot. The dynasty ended with Tutankhamun's death. The evidence from the DNA study also fits a broader pattern. The Egyptian empire was not invincible. It was built on human bodies, on the labor of millions, on the stability of the Nile, but also on the fragility of the royal family. The pharaohs could not control their own biology. They could not protect their children from inherited disease. The empire's longevity was partly due to the ability to adapt, but the biological cost was hidden. The failure to recognize the signs in antiquity was not a missed signal in the modern sense. The physicians of the time did not understand genetics. They attributed deformities to the gods. They did not connect the numerous deaths of royal children to the practice of sibling marriage. The system was self-reinforcing. The more the bloodline was preserved, the more it deteriorated. The modern investigation, led by Zahi Hawass and financed by the Discovery Channel, had its own set of pressures. The discovery was announced with great fanfare. The media focused on the incest story. The Egyptian government used the findings to promote tourism. The scientific community demanded more evidence. The tension between public narrative and scientific caution continues today, but the bodies themselves remain. The mummies of KV21A and KV35YL are still in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. They are not displayed. They are stored in boxes. Their DNA is preserved in freezers. The information from the study has been used to trace other mummies. In 2018, a team from the Institute for Mummy Studies in Bolzano, Italy, published a new analysis using next-generation sequencing on the same mummies. They confirmed the earlier findings. The chain of evidence held. The human consequences are still felt. Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered in 1922, and the golden mask became a symbol of Egypt. But the boy behind the mask was a sickly teenager who died in pain. The 1,000 objects in his tomb were for his afterlife. He could not walk without canes. He could not hunt or fight. He was a prisoner of his own blood. The Egyptian empire lasted for 3,000 years. The pharaohs who believed they would rule forever were, in the end, mortals like the rest. Their bodies have been scanned, tested, and catalogued. The secrets they tried to hide have been extracted from the dust. The story of their kinship is written in the same DNA that all humans carry. The empire is gone, but the evidence remains. And every decade, new tools reveal a little more of what the sand has kept. In 2012, a team of scientists from the University of Cairo conducted a CT scan of the mummy of Ramesses III. The mummy had been housed in the Egyptian Museum for decades. The scan revealed something hidden beneath the wrappings, a deep cut to the throat nearly severing the vertebrae. The trachea was severed cleanly. The wound ran from the front of the neck to the back, just below the jaw. It was a mortal wound. The official cause of death had been listed as old age or illness. Now the evidence pointed to something else. What happened? The death of Ramesses III had been debated for a century. He reigned from 1186 to 1155 BCE during the 20th dynasty. He was the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. After him, Egypt entered a slow decline. The papyri known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin recorded a conspiracy in the royal harem. A secondary wife named Tai plotted to kill the king and place her son Pentower on the throne. The plot involved officials, magicians, and guards. The conspirators were tried and executed, but the papyrus did not say whether the assassination succeeded. It only described the punishment. The CT scan now confirmed that the pharaoh had indeed been killed. Investigators examined the mummy closely. They found a deep cut in the throat, 7 centimeters wide, reaching the bone. The wound was covered by thick layers of linen, possibly applied after death. The pharaoh had been mummified in a hurry. The embalmers had placed a large quantity of resin inside the wound, perhaps to hide it. The CT scan also revealed a separate amulet placed over the cut, a wedged eye symbol meant to protect the king in the afterlife. The embalmers knew the wound was there. They did their best to conceal it. The mummy of the supposed conspirator, Pentower, was also examined. It was a mummy found in the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari. Labeled as the unknown man E, the body had been unwrapped, left in a natural state of decomposition, and placed in a simple coffin. The CT scan showed that the man was young, around 18 to 20 years old. His organs had not been removed. The body was covered in red ochre, a sign of impurity. The forensic team concluded that he had been suffocated or strangled. The evidence matched the judicial papyrus account that Pentower was forced to commit suicide. The assassination of Ramesses III was a failure of the palace security system. The pharaoh was surrounded by guards, officials, and servants. Yet the conspirators managed to strike. The harem was a private area separated from the main palace. Ta had access to the king through the women's quarters. She used magic and bribery. The officials who were loyal to the king were either deceived or complicit. The system relied on personal loyalty, not institutional checks. When that loyalty broke down, the king was vulnerable. The aftermath was swift. The conspirators were arrested. The trials were held in secret. The sentences ranged from execution to forced suicide. Teai's fate is unknown. The record was sealed. The kingdom carried on, but the cracks had deepened. Ramesses IV, the rightful heir, took the throne. He faced economic troubles, grain shortages, and worker strikes. The empire was no longer expanding. The borders were under pressure from the sea peoples. The administration was corrupt. The assassination of a pharaoh was a symptom of a system that was losing control. The modern investigation using CT scans and DNA answered a question that the ancient records had left open, but it also raised new questions. How did the conspirators get close enough? Why did the guards not intervene? Was there a larger faction within the court? The judicial papyrus mentions names but not motives. The evidence from the mummy gave a physical confirmation of the violence, but the silence of the dead remains. The story of Ramesses III matters because it marks a turning point. The Egyptian empire had survived internal struggles before. Hatshepsut had been erased from records. Akhenaten's religious revolution had been reversed. But the assassination of a pharaoh by his own wife and son was a new level of breakdown. The divine king was not divine enough to stop a blade. The empire would stumble on for another 300 years, but the golden age was over. The mummies keep the truth. The sand keeps the rest.